Robert Rollo Gillespie was, according to Sir John Fortescue, the historian of the British Army, the bravest man to ever wear a red coat. And when you look at the men who fought in Britain's many wars in the 18th and 19th centuries, that's a pretty bold claim, especially as he's not nowadays a household name. But when you consider that he killed a man in a duel, was court-martialed for fraud but vindicated, was nearly shot for being a spy, fought off 8 burglars in his nightgown, killing 6 with his sword, suppressed the most serious sepoy mutiny in India before 1857, had a run-in with the founder of Singapore, Sir Stamford Raffles, and fought the French in the Caribbean, the Dutch in the East Indies, and the Gurkhas in the Himalayas, and all by the time a sniper's bullet ended his life at the age of 48. Maybe Sir John was right. So let's find out whether Major General Robert Rollo Gillespie really deserves that title of the bravest man ever to wear a red coat. Hugh Robert Rollo Gillespie was born on the 21st of January 1766 in the small town of Comber, County Down, Ireland. Whilst his father, Robert Gillespie, had intended for his son to study at Cambridge University and become a lawyer, his son had set his heart on becoming a soldier. In 1783, when he was 17, he was commissioned as a cornet, which is the most junior officer rank at the time, in the 3rd Irish Horse. This long-established regiment had been raised back in 1685 during the Monmouth Rebellion, and they had gone on to fight at the Battle of Blenheim and in the Jacobite revolts. In 1788, they would become the 6th Dragoon Guards. While still a teenager, Gillespie had also earned the local renown in his hometown as the strongest man in Comber. It's a rather suitable headline grabber for a man who became nothing short of a legend in his lifetime. Even before he fought his first action, his life was raising eyebrows. In 1786, when he was just 20, he married Annabel Taylor from County Dublin, despite only knowing her for a matter of weeks. Maybe unsurprisingly, her parents didn't approve, but a year later, they must really have despaired of their new and probably unwanted son-in-law. In 1787, his regiment was stationed at Athy in County Kildare, Ireland, and it was here in December 1787 that he acted as a second for a brother officer, Lieutenant Mackenzie, in a duel with a local bigwig, William Barrington. After the two duellists had discharged their shots to no effect, Gillespie somehow got embroiled in an argument with Barrington in which the latter insulted both him and his regiment. Now Gillespie immediately challenged him to a duel. And in that duel, both men fired simultaneously. Whilst Gillespie had a lucky escape when Barrington's bullet deflected off a button, his shot hit Barrington in the heart, killing him. The young officer now fled to Scotland. However, after a few months on the run with his young wife, he returned to Ireland in March 1788 to stand trial for murder. Despite the recommendations of the judge, the jury, which happened to contain several army officers, returned a verdict of justifiable homicide, and he was acquitted. With war with revolutionary France on the horizon, he purchased a lieutenancy in the 20th Light Dragoons, who were heading for the Caribbean. Now, nowadays that sounds like a cushy posting, but back then, whenever there was a war between Britain and France, each sought to take control of their rivals' sugar-rich and therefore economically valuable islands in the West Indies. So if young Gillespie was looking for action, it was almost certainly going to be there. When France finally declared war in 1793, the British did indeed send a major expedition to the Caribbean. But before he saw any shooting, Gillespie notched up a few more ticks on life's bucket list. En route to Jamaica, he was shipwrecked on the Portuguese island of Madeira, where he then contracted yellow fever. Even today, fatalities in severe cases of yellow fever are anywhere between 30 and 60%. Back in the 18th century, it was a death sentence. Or at least for normal mortals. But we are dealing with the strongest man in Comber. Gillespie made a full recovery from this killer disease and went on to join his regiment in Jamaica. He also got his wish of seeing some action, as the British landed on several French islands in the Caribbean. One of those was Saint-Dominique, the western part of the island of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti. It was during the attempted capture of the fort at Port-au-Prince that action man Gillespie very nearly met his end. With the French governor refusing to surrender to the Royal Navy fleet in the harbour, and his guns preventing any amphibious landing, Gillespie, together with another officer, volunteered to swim ashore to try to talk him into capitulation. By now holding the rank of captain, he stripped off his red tunic and, placing his sword between his teeth, jumped into the sea and swam to shore, whilst under fire from the fort. Reaching the shore, both men were captured. They were brought before the governor, who, as Gillespie was not wearing a uniform, decided that he was a spy and ordered his execution. But he was to cheat death in a very lucky escape. Fortunately, Gillespie noticed an insignia of Freemasonry hanging from the French commander's neck. He informed him that he was a brother Mason, and the French commander relented, and Gillespie lived to fight another day. The British, with the support of the Spanish, who controlled the eastern half of the island, briefly took control of the French colony. During this occupation, Gillespie was appointed Adjutant General in Saint-Dominique. One night, he heard a commotion downstairs in his house. Bounding down the stairs in his nightgown, he was confronted by 8 robbers who'd already killed one of his servants. There are suggestions that they were actually revolutionary supporters, intent on assassinating a senior British officer. Either way, he was outnumbered 8-1. How could he get out of this dangerous situation? Still wearing his nightgown, Gillespie grabbed his sword and single-handedly took on all 8 men, killing 6 of them, before being shot and seriously wounded himself. He was sent back to Britain to recuperate, where he found that he was a bit of a celebrity. His celebrity status was further enhanced when he was introduced to King George III, who supposedly remarked, "Is this the little man that killed the brigands?" Once more promoted, he returned to Jamaica to take command of the 20th Light Dragoons. When the Treaty of Amiens produced a short-lived peace between France and Great Britain, his regiment was recalled home. In 1804, his incredible life took yet another twist. He faced a court-martial for embezzlement and fraud. The case, brought by a disgruntled officer whom Gillespie had reprimanded in Jamaica, was that the regiment's surgeons had exceeded their allowances, and that the commanding officer had pocketed the difference. At the court-martial, Gillespie argued that he had allowed the surgeons to exceed their budgets in the best interests of their patients. He argued that the budgets set by the army were based upon European conditions and took no account of the tropical diseases that were the scourge of regiments serving in the West Indies. Thus, he went on, the surgeons needed to spend more to save lives. He certainly had a point. Tropical diseases, like yellow fever, were so rife and deadly in the Caribbean that many soldiers saw a posting there as a death sentence. This actually resulted on more than one occasion in troops refusing to board ships bound there. The court-martial received many letters from fellow officers defending both his reputation and his actions. He was honourably acquitted. By now, however, Robert Rollo Gillespie was facing financial difficulties and sought out a more lucrative posting in India. He duly gained a posting with the 19th Light Dragoons. The normal route to India was the long and tedious sea journey all the way round the southern tip of Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Gillespie opted for a faster route, across Europe and the Middle East, before picking up a ship in the Arabian Gulf for the short journey onwards to Bombay. It might have been a faster route, but it was fraught with its own dangers. And it won't surprise you to know that Gillespie found himself in the thick of them. By now, Britain and France were back at war, and whilst he was in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul in Turkey, he was challenged to a duel by a French officer. I wonder if Gillespie felt a sense of déjà vu. This time, the choice of weapons, at the Frenchman's insistence, was swords. Nevertheless, Gillespie bested his opponent, wounding and disarming him before sparing his life. No doubt rather pleased with his performance, he continued on his journey through the Middle East. And on that journey, between Aleppo in Syria and Baghdad, modern-day Iraq, he was held up by a band of Arabs, intent on robbing and then murdering both Gillespie and his servant. If ever there was someone who epitomised the phrase luck of the Irish, it was our man from County Down. Whilst he was being held up, the leader of the band of robbers became ill. Gillespie now opened up his medical box and cured the Arab of whatever he was suffering from. The grateful bandit spared Gillespie's life, and he and his servant were allowed on their merry way. The rest of his journey to India must have seemed pretty mundane. From Baghdad he travelled to Basra, where he boarded a ship for Bombay. From there he travelled overland to Madras on the eastern side of the subcontinent, where he joined the 19th Dragoons. Stationed at Arcot, he'd only been in position a few days when a terrified rider galloped into their camp with alarming news. The sepoys garrisoned at Vellore, about 16 miles away, had mutinied. The Vellore Mutiny on the 10th of July 1806 deserves an episode in its own right, because it was the first time sepoys had rebelled against the East India Company, predating the Great Revolt in 1857 by half a century. And rather like events in 1857, the mutiny was in no small part thanks to the British authorities' complete insensitivity to their Indian troops. In an effort to make them look more like British soldiers, the sepoys were ordered to shave off their beards, remove religious marks from their foreheads, and replace their turbans with British-style headgear. Those who refused ended up either being demoted, flogged, or dismissed. And strangely enough, the sepoys resented both the orders and the punishments, and they turned on their officers and the British redcoats stationed with them at Vellore. By the time the messenger had arrived at Gillespie's camp at Arcot, nearly 100 British had already been killed in the fort, and those who remained were desperately holding out up on the ramparts. Within 15 minutes of hearing the news of the mutiny, he had assembled the 19th Dragoons, a squadron of Madras native cavalry, and galloper guns, and set off for Vellore. By the way, galloper guns were small artillery pieces that could be pulled by just one horse, which allowed them to swiftly move at the same speed as the infantry or cavalry that they were supporting, rather than the larger guns which rumbled some way behind. Gillespie and about 20 of his dragoons galloped ahead of the rest of the column, arriving at Vellore 9 hours after the mutiny had begun. There he discovered that 60 men from the 69th Regiment of Foot, later the Welsh Regiment, under the command of a sergeant by the name of Brady, along with 2 surgeons, were still holding out on the ramparts, but were almost out of ammunition. With no ladder to climb up to them, Gillespie ordered Brady to make a rope out of his men's belts, and then up he went. Taking command, he now personally led the men of the 69th in a bayonet charge to clear the ramparts. When the rest of his column arrived, he ordered them to blow open the massive gates with their galloper guns. Entering the compound, the 19th, along with the Madras cavalry, charged. The mutiny was rapidly and brutally suppressed. 350 mutineers were killed in the rising, including 100 who were summarily executed on Gillespie's orders by being lined up against a wall and fired at with canister shot. The violence meted out on both sides was also a foreshadow of the 1857 Indian Rebellion. And whilst the Vellore Mutiny never spread, like in 1857, it certainly had civilian supporters or maybe instigators, not least the sons of Tipu Sultan. As I say, I think it'd be a really good episode in its own right. What do you think? Please do drop me a line. Victorian poet Sir Henry Newbolt, who famously wrote the poem Vitae Lampada about the Battle of Abu Klea with the immortal cry, "Play up and play the game," also penned a poem about Gillespie's ride to Vellore nearly 100 years after the event. Entitled Gillespie, the last verse reads, "They kept the tale 100 years, they'll keep the tale 100 more. Riding at dawn, riding alone, Gillespie came to false Vellore." Lauded in Britain as the hero of Vellore, Gillespie went on to command the King's Royal Irish Light Dragoons, and by 1811 had been promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. It was now time for the next chapter in his amazing life, taking on the French and the Dutch in the East Indies, and crossing swords with the founder of Singapore, Sir Stamford Raffles. The Dutch had ruled the economically valuable Spice Islands of the East Indies, which is now Indonesia, for the best part of 200 years. In 1810, during the Napoleonic Wars, the Kingdom of Holland was annexed by France and Java became a French colony. Jan Willem Janssens was personally appointed as governor of the colony by Napoleon. He had previously been the governor of the Dutch Cape Colony, which he had been forced to surrender to a British military force back in 1806, and therefore detested the British. So, a good man for Napoleon to have in charge of the important Spice Islands. The British government and the East India Company saw French control of the islands as a threat to commerce in the region. They also saw them as a bargaining chip in any future peace negotiations. Basically, the more of your enemy's valuable economic or strategic colonies you could hold, the stronger your negotiating position. And they didn't come much more valuable than the East Indies. In fact, maybe they could even keep them. In April 1811, a British expedition consisting of 25 ships set sail from India. Gillespie was appointed to command a division of 12,000 men, tasked with taking the main island of Java. On arrival in the island of Java, They faced an enemy of about 17,000, consisting of Dutch, French, and local troops, all commanded by the governor, General Janssens. The Dutchman, however, was wary of the British forces, and he hoped that tropical diseases would weaken his adversaries, who could then be broken attempting to storm several forts that he had constructed on the island. Consequently, the British landing on the island on the 4th of August was unopposed, and they entered the undefended capital, Batavia, 4 days later. The defenders now concentrated their force at Fort Cornelis, which bristled with 280 cannon. Following a brief siege, during which disease did indeed take a toll on his troops, Gillespie launched an assault on the morning of the 26th of August. For that assault on Fort Cornelis, Gillespie was reunited with the 69th Regiment of Foot, the men from Vellore. The Brigadier General personally led his men forward, capturing 2 key redoubts, during which he killed a French colonel in hand-to-hand fighting. Wounded, taking the 2nd redoubt, he collapsed from exhaustion. But when his staff officers came to his assistance, he shooed them away. Staggering to his feet, he proceeded to cut a horse loose from a gun limber. He then mounted and gave chase to the retreating enemy soldiers, leading his men on to capture the fort. Less than 3 weeks later, General Janssens surrendered the island to the British. It would remain in British hands for the next 2 years, when, with peace in Europe restored, it was handed back to the Dutch. With control established on Java, Gillespie was now appointed commander of the occupying forces. In that capacity, in 1812, he led a force to the neighbouring island of Sumatra to depose the pro-Dutch Sultan of Palembang. On his return to Java, he found that a coalition of Javanese chiefs had assembled an army of over 30,000 men to eject the British. Taking a force of just 1,500 men, Gillespie personally led the charge against the fortified positions near Jakarta, which ended the revolt. Whilst Gillespie was the military commander on Java, he shared British authority with the civilian Lieutenant Governor of the island, Stamford Raffles, the man who had only a few years later found Singapore. However, their relationship soon deteriorated, with Gillespie unhappy with Raffles' administration of the island. He actually complained to the East India Company, who launched an inquiry and eventually found against Raffles in 1814. By then, Gillespie was back in India, now promoted to the rank of Major General. Ever the man of action, one day he was attending a race meeting at Bangalore when a tiger appeared on the track. A man who seemed to thrive on danger, Gillespie ran onto the track and shot the beast dead. Was there anything this soldier wouldn't or couldn't do? It seemed only appropriate that this warrior should be sent for when, in 1814, the British went to war with the fearsome Gurkhas. Now, I've covered the Anglo-Nepalese War and how it led to the Gurkhas serving in the British Army in a previous episode. Check it out at the end. Gillespie was placed in charge of one of the 4 columns advancing into Nepal. It consisted of 3,500 men, including 1,000 British regulars from the 8th Dragoons and the 53rd Regiment of Foot, later the King's Shropshire Light Infantry. Advancing from the east into the Himalayan kingdom, Gillespie's was the first of the columns to go into action. Now, why wouldn't that surprise you? His objective was the Gurkha-held fort at Kalunga. The fort, set against the backdrop of the snow-covered Himalayas, was in an impressive setting, with steep crevices protecting it. It was only defended by 600 Gurkhas. Gillespie, on the other hand, had nearly 5 times that number. He manoeuvred his men into position for the tricky attack, but before he could advance, the Gurkhas launched their own offensive. Despite only being a fifth of the strength of their British opponents, they sallied out of the fort and assaulted the British lines. Steadying his sepoys, who were somewhat taken aback by the suddenness and the ferocity, they returned fire. Despite their bravery, the Nepalese were slowly forced to fall back on their fort. As they retreated, Gillespie decided that he would chase them and enter through the open gate. He ordered his troops, the 53rd Regiment of Foot and the 8th Dragoons, who were dismounted, forward. As the British closed in on the narrow gate, it was their turn to be met by a hail of concentrated fire. Sword in one hand, pistol in the other, Gillespie went out to the front of his men. Turning to Charles Pratt Kennedy, a horse gunner and fellow Ulsterman, he roared, "One more shot for the honour of Down!" and then led his men forward. Still at the front and just 30 metres from the fort's gate, he was shot through the heart by a Gurkha sniper. As their mortally wounded commander was carried downhill, the morale of his column collapsed. Not surprising in many ways, because they must have thought with his track record he was indestructible. His second-in-command ordered a retreat. They'd lost 35 men dead and 228 wounded. Included in the dead, Major General Robert Rollo Gillespie. He was 48 years old. By the way, the fort would not be taken for another month, and this victory has gone down in Gurkha folklore. The campaign itself would drag on until March 1816. Gillespie, the British hero of the Vellore Mutiny, was buried at the military cantonment at Meerut, India. And with a sense of historic irony, it was at Meerut that the Indian Mutiny, which sparked into a major revolt against the British, broke out in 1857. Very much the hero of his day, a memorial statue of Gillespie was unveiled in St Paul's Cathedral in 1826. It's still there. Far more impressive is the 55-foot tall memorial that was erected in the square in his hometown of Comba in 1845. The unveiling was attended by 50 lodges of the Masonic Order, which it's claimed to be the largest Masonic gathering in Irish history. They were part of a crowd estimated between 25 and 30,000 people, crowding into the square to celebrate and honour the strongest man in Comba. And at the base of the memorial column, which still stands, are the last words he shouted just before his death at the Battle of Nalapani. "One shot more for the honour of Down." A great battle cry, assuming he really said it of course, from the Major General from Ulster, who killed a man in a duel, was nearly shot for being a spy, fought off 8 burglars in his nightgown, killing 6 of them with his sword, suppressed the most serious sepoy mutiny in India before 1857, had a run-in with the founder of Singapore, Sir Stamford Raffles, and fought the French in the Caribbean, the Dutch in the East Indies, and the Gurkhas in the Himalayas. Killed leading his men from the front. Maybe Sir John Fortescue was right, and Major General Robert Rollo Gillespie was the bravest man ever to wear a red coat. What do you think? I just want to thank all of you who support my work as either patrons or by becoming members or making one-off donations here on YouTube. A particular shout out to Anita, Stuart, Charlie and QA Library. You can find out how to support me in the description below. Plenty more stories in the pipeline, but in the meantime, thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.